Everyone, we're going to go ahead and get thanks for joining us for this month's Restoring Neighborhoods Task Force meeting. As I mentioned in the multiple emails that you've received, we have a full agenda, and I think it's going to be really valuable content for you guys. So I'm going to dive into some policy updates after we do a couple introductions of folks here in the room. So Rebecca King with the National Housing Conference.
Ethan Handelman with NHC.
Brian Sumberg with the National Housing Conference.
And we also have Danielle Kutch with the Treasury Department and Julia Gordon joining us. But I will get to that in just a second. I'm going to do a quick round of policy updates, starting with Senate HUD appropriations. In case you missed it, the Senate Appropriations Committee did approve funding for HUD for FY 2017. And overall, it's a pretty good budget given the constraints they're working with. They had small increases for vouchers, for PBRA, for public housing, homeless assistance, and housing for the elderly. The bill would raise the RAD cap to 250,000 units and also allow 202 conversions under RAD. Additionally, it would authorize HUD to implement a voucher mobility demonstration and keep both home and CDBG level with current year's funding. Choice neighborhoods would be cut down to about 80 million, but that was one of the most significant cuts in the bill. That being said, keeping in mind the bigger picture, the Senate had 302B levels and agreed to these top-level spending numbers. The House does not have that agreement in place. They're still considering a budget.
Well, they've pretty much given up on actually passing a budget. That seems pretty clear. What they haven't given up on yet, but also haven't come to agreement yet, is what overall funding levels they're going to allocate under. Those are the 302B levels that you mentioned that the Senate came to. Those should flow somewhat logically from the overall budget caps agreed to in the 2-year deal. We're in the second year of that deal. The challenge is the Republican majority does not yet have a sufficient majority of its members to pass a top-line budget and the 302B allocations on its own. So that has really held up the process. And from what we're hearing, there's not a lot of optimism that in the limited calendar time available to them in an election year that they'll reach sufficient agreement. All of that suggests to me that a continuing resolution to get us through the election is more likely than in past years. But this is a year of surprises, so who knows?
That is certainly true. So we will keep you posted on appropriations as they do or do not move forward. Last month we touched on the FHFA principal reduction decision that was expected, and since then it has come out. So FHFA will offer principal reduction to certain seriously delinquent underwater borrowers, but it will be a one-time offering, and the size of the program is anticipated to be fairly small. It's for owner-occupant borrowers who are 90 days or more delinquent as of March 1st of 2016, with an outstanding unpaid principal balance of $250,000 or less, and their mark-to-market loan-to-value ratio exceeds 115%. So a limited approach, which isn't surprising given what we expected. At the same time, they also announced some changes to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's non-performing loan sales. So now both GSEs have to evaluate borrowers for principal forgiveness and address vacant units. And get to outcomes a little bit that are more certain when they're dealing with their non-performing loan sales. So interesting developments there. And then lastly, Treasury has also announced the final allocation of the $1 billion that were available through hardest hit competitively. So 13 of the 19 participating states will receive additional funds. So I'm not going to get into any more details, but they have to use the funds by December 31st, 2020, and we will send out the announcement so you can see the funding allocations by state. With that, I will just remind you that you can submit questions throughout all the presentations using the question box. Don't wait, just go ahead as they occur to you. We will do Q&A at the end of each presentation today. With that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Danielle Kutch with the Treasury Department. She is the acting chief of the Homeownership Preservation Office with Treasury and manages the Making Home Affordable and Hardest Hit programs, and we're very glad to have her today. Danielle, I'm turning it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so today I am going to talk to you about the wind down of Making Home Affordable. As hopefully you know, when Congress passed the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2016, they also included in that act a provision which terminates the Making Home Affordable program except for certain applications received for a modification prior to December 31st, 2016. And so we've begun the process in rolling out our guidance as to how we will be winding down the program and the requirements for servicers in how they will accept applications until that application deadline of December 30th, 2016. So we issued our first supplemental directive back in March with the initial guidance, which I'll run through today. And then actually just on Monday, we issued a second SD that covers more in-depth review of the handbook and all of our program guidance as to what will or will not be required as we continue into 2017 and the out years, and what responsibilities servicers will have to continue to maintain for HAMP and what will actually go away. So that SD, as I said, just came out on Monday, and so we can, if you have questions about that, we can go through them, or we can also set up subsequent conversations to walk through that. As mentioned, the other piece of that legislation was also related to the Hardest Hit Fund, which actually allowed us to extend that program to 2017 and provided the authority for us to obligate an additional $2 billion to the hardest hit fund states. And so we did that in a two-phase process, and I'll cover some of that in this presentation as well. So the first thing I want to do is talk about some of the highlights of Making Home Affordable, or MHA. We have helped more than 1.8 million families to date. We're really proud of this number, but even more significant is the number of modifications that have been conducted outside of HAMP in particular, and follow very closely the guidelines that HAMP set and the precedents that HAMP set for how a modification should be conducted. So based on that influence, more than 7 million modifications and loss mitigation interventions have been provided since 2009. So way more than the total number of HAMP modifications, but the influence of HAMP has certainly been there to influence how those modifications were done. In addition, homeowners have saved approximately $41 billion to date in their monthly mortgage payments. And as I said, the standards that HAMP set have resulted in better performance and sustainability of modifications in general. So that is one of the lasting impacts that we hope to have with HAMP and the Making Home Affordable program overall. As we move into the wind down, we have three primary goals, and that is to execute the wind down of MHA programs in an effective and efficient manner. We also would want to preserve the loss mitigation knowledge and strategies that have been utilized over the past several years in order to influence any future loss mitigation that comes, or should another crisis occur. We want to make sure that those lessons are preserved and can be used again at any future point in time. And so to facilitate that, we are coordinating with various stakeholders and ensuring that we communicate a consistent message regarding the wind down activities, as well as what comes after HAMP. And so a lot of those discussions are ongoing. I'm sure Julia can talk some about those too in her presentation. But there is an ongoing dialogue of what comes next and how do we make sure that these lessons learned are preserved. So as I mentioned earlier, this slide is just covering some of what I summarized earlier. about the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2016 and the termination of MHA. And as I mentioned, we have, it was actually May 2nd, issued the second SD that's noted here. The driving force with the guidance that we have issued is to preserve as much of the protections that we have built into HAMP, whether that is for a borrower getting into HAMP the December 30th, 2016 date, or whether it's for a borrower who is in a permanent HAMP modification, and some of those things like post-modification counseling and those other, and the notification about some of their incentives and that kind of stuff. We wanted to make sure we preserve those structures as we go through the out years of HAMP, even when there's no new volume coming in. So our goal in all of the guidance that we have been issuing is to wind things down effectively and make sure that we're doing so in an efficient manner that doesn't overly burden either the homeowner in applying or the servicer as they continue to see a decreasing volume of modifications, but making sure, most importantly, to preserve those borrower protections that we've implemented throughout the years. So getting to the specifics, so for applications received on or after January 1st, 2017, the servicers may but are not, I'm sorry, this date is actually wrong. So it's for applications, this should actually say, for applications received, I'm really sorry, this is one of the first times I'm really reviewing this presentation, and it's changed since the last time I looked at it. So for applications received on or after January 1st, 2017, servicers cannot put a borrower into MHA solutions. So please disregard this. It's for applications received on or before December 30th, 2016. Then the servicer is still going to be offering MHA solutions to qualifying borrowers. The second piece of that is that they have to also have a permanent modification effective date before December 1st, 2017, or the short sale has to close before December 1st, 2017. We also, here, this is actually the better slide. So for HAMP in particular, what that means is that an initial package must be received on or before December 30th, 2016 to be eligible for consideration. And then the servicer has the majority of 2017 to collect any remaining documents that they may need to evaluate that borrower per a complete loss mitigation application. And they have to conduct that evaluation, get the borrower into a trial, and then have a permanent modification by December 1st, 2017. So those are the key dates, December 30th, 2016 and December 1st, 2017. For applications received after that, the servicer will not be able to evaluate them for HAMP because of that termination date in the appropriations bill. So that is the initial package is for HAMP Tier 1, Tier 2, or possibly even Streamline. The condition for a Streamline HAMP modification effective December 30th is that before that date, the homeowner doesn't have to submit anything to receive a Streamline HAMP offer. After December 30th, the homeowner will have actually had to submit something before that date to be able to, for the servicer to send them an offer in 2017. And the reason behind that is we have to show that they have submitted some portion, at least, of an application to be considered for HAMP. For a short sale or deed in lieu under HAFA, the transaction actually has to be approved on or before December 30th, 2016. So this means that you either have to have an approved sales contract or the pre-approval for the listing of the property on or before December 30th, 2016. And then you also have to meet the closing date of on or before December 1st, 2017 in order to be eligible for the relocation assistance under HAFA. for our forbearance plans under UP, you will notice that this is a much earlier date of May, and one of the reasons for that being we wanted to start to give servicers some flexibility in offering a shorter forbearance term in order to make sure that if the borrower has a shorter forbearance period, still isn't employed, and wants an opportunity to get into HAMP, then we wanted to preserve some of that opportunity for the program end date, the application deadline of December 30th. And so beginning May 1st, 2016, servicers will be allowed to offer a proprietary forbearance plan in lieu of UP. And so it may be a shorter period so that they then can also inform the borrower that after that period they may be eligible for HAMP. We have put a lot of other protections in place here around this, and basically saying if you're going to do this, you have to clearly communicate with the borrower when they come out of this forbearance plan whether or not HAMP will be an option for them. And we've also said that similar to UP, you can't foreclose on that borrower while they're in that forbearance plan. So we've tried to move some of those protections over there. The other key part of this is that if the servicer is going to continue to offer UP in lieu of their proprietary program, then they have to offer that forbearance plan to the borrower, and it has to be approved on or before December 30th, 2016. So in our last program, 2MP, this is basically the same requirements as HAMP in that they have to have submitted their initial package for review under HAMP before December 30th, 2016. And then that 2MP match has to come in to receive the second lien modification, and that second lien modification or extinguishment has to be completed on or before December 1st, 2017. So the other thing that we note here, and that we did in our first supplemental directive 1602 that we issued on this guidance, was that we also provided servicers the ability to move to a more general solicitation package beginning September 1st, 2016. And the reason behind this is today we have very specific requirements around what is included in solicitation to borrowers and how the servicer goes about doing those solicitations. There was a lot of concern that we may be telling the borrower that something is available, but by the time they're solicited in November or December, there's not really an opportunity to complete the initial package and get it in by the deadline. And so we wanted to make sure that the more important thing is that HAMP is going away, but there will be loss mitigation solutions provided after this. And so servicers are required to review that initial package if it comes in before the December 30th date. And if they're potentially eligible, the servicer is still required to put them in HAMP first. But if it comes in after that, then there still will be options available to the homeowner. And so we wanted to make sure that we were reducing some of the potential confusion there on the borrower's end with very specific HAMP language, and just tightening up controls on the back end and making sure that the servicer was doing the correct evaluation. So this is the single point of contact or your relationship manager, our escalations process, reporting, and post-modification counseling are some other key parts that we actually discuss in Supplemental Directive 1603 that we just put out. And so I think one of the most important things for those of you on the phone today will actually be around our escalations process. So as we transition and we do this wind down process, both MHA Help and the HAMP Solutions Center, which some of you may have used HSC in the past, they actually will not receive or escalate cases after December 1st, 2017. And any cases that they have before that date, the servicer has to resolve them and get concurrence from MHA Help or HSC, as they do today, by May 1st, 2018. And so that's probably one of the key pieces for those of you on the phone, is knowing when you can continue to use the HAMP Solutions Center and when they will start to wind down their activities. Of interest may also be post-modification counseling, and On the trial part, all of that remains the same as it is in our guidance today. And then on the risk of default borrowers, the servicer has to continue to offer counseling to a borrower who misses one or more payments. But we have said that once you reach either the end of the borrower's step-up period, where their interest rate in a Tier 1 is stepping up, or the end of the incentive period, which is the 6th year for both HAMP Tier 1, Tier 2, as well as Streamline, then the servicer will have met those obligations and would no longer be required to offer post-modification counseling to an at-risk borrower. However, this is a key point in our discussions as we talk about life after HAMP. We really believe in post-modification counseling, as well as counseling in general and the role of counselors in this area. And so we are going to be working hard to continue to push this and make sure that we can demonstrate the value here that's added to a homeowner who is struggling. So next I'll talk briefly about the Hardest Hit Fund and what's been going on there. Of note, the Hardest Hit Fund now actually has $9.6 billion that's provided to 18 states in the District of Columbia to develop locally tailored programs to assist homeowners in their communities. We announced our first announcement regarding this additional $2 billion commitment was made in February 2016. And that's where we announced the Phase 1 and Phase 2 process. And so here you can see the states that currently have HHF programs and what their allocations are and the number of homeowners that they've assisted to date. So if you have any particular questions about a particular state, we could talk more about that. But all of the states currently have programs. Some of the states had utilized all of their funds prior to this additional allocation, and so they had shut down or were operating on a very limited basis as funds became available. And so a lot of them that have closed will either be reopening or expanding the programs that they had closed or offering new programs. So there's a lot more to come in this space with Hardest Hit Fund and what will be coming there. As I mentioned, we did a two-phase process. We did $1 billion via an allocation process to 18 of the 19 eligible HFAs. And in that, we provided that allocation and focused it based on the state population and the HFA's utilization of their HHF allocation as of that date when we announced. And so states that had spent more of their money received a higher allocation, and that was the intent, is to focus these additional funds where they can be spent on the areas that still have the greatest need, as well as in places where they can spend and utilize the funds in an expeditious manner that falls within the criteria for Hardest Hit Fund. The second phase was based on an application, and those funds were announced 2 weeks ago. I believe it was April 20th, and so we had 13 states receive additional funding of that $1 billion allocated among the 13 states that had applied. So moving back to MHA quickly, some of the lessons that we've learned and that we are focusing on incorporating and preserving as we wind the program down is one of the most important ones being payment reduction. The amount of payment reduction has a significant impact on performance of the loan, and so as we consider options for the future, this is one thing that we really think the industry and stakeholders should be focused on incorporating into any future models. We also strongly believe in the role that principal reduction plays. We have seen through HAMP, the HAMP Principal Reduction Alternative Program, or PRA, that loans with principal reduction do perform better at certain stages than loans without principal reduction. So it certainly is a good tool to have available where the situation is appropriate. We also know that delinquency at time of modification is a key driver of performance, and that the earlier you get to the borrower, the more likely they are to perform long-term in that modification. We also have learned that the robust infrastructure and processes that MHA implemented are important and have driven change in the industry and have also likely contributed to the performance of these loans. So for both servicers and homeowners, these key process points that were introduced by HAMP, like single point of contact, the defined protocols around outreach to delinquent homeowners, protections against dual tracking, our third-party escalation process, our compliance process, all of those things have had a role in shaping. Many of these have been actually adopted by the industry and the CFPB, but we should continue to push as we move forward for the standardization of some of these. And then finally, we also strongly believe in looking holistically at the borrower situation, and so assessing, what tools do you have available to you, and how do you apply them to the various situations. If a borrower is underwater, then you should look at principal reduction. You should look at the options that you have available. If the homeowner has a second lien and needs assistance with that, we need to be looking holistically at their picture and not just solving for the first lien when the second lien could also be contributing to the hardship or the delinquency. And then the other thing is what does the hardship look like, and how long is the hardship going to last, and then providing the appropriate solution for that. So those are really the key things that we have been focusing on here at MHA, and I can open it up for questions that you have either on MHA or the Hardship Fund.
Thanks so much, Danielle. Folks, please send your questions through the question box, or if you can raise your hand, I can try to unmute you as well.
Danielle, while we're taking questions through the interface, this is Ethan. Is it all right if I ask you a couple of things?
Absolutely.
So when you're looking at the different state programs that are either restarting or expanding their efforts under hardest hit, are most of them simply expanding stuff they've already done, or are there some that have either made a breakthrough in innovation, or changed course with what they're trying to do? Is it only more of the same but bigger, or are there some real changes that you're seeing too?
It's really a mix of both. So some states where they have the infrastructure in place and they haven't completely closed down. So I'm thinking more like in Oregon, their LRAP program. They are going to just simply reopen that program. They may make some minor tweaks to it, offer it to a broader, they do it by certain counties at this point. They may offer it in a broader area than they do now, but they'll be looking to do mostly what they have been doing because they have success and they still have a need for it. Other states who have been closed, as they looked at where their need was, it's going to shift from where it was when they shut down 2 years ago. And it may not be as focused on the unemployed borrower. It may be focused more on how do you continue to recover in that state, and so maybe you have more of a down payment assistance program approach and those kinds of things. So we're seeing a range of people from just reopening programs, making tweaks to their existing programs, or opening completely new programs, be it down payment assistance or principal forgiveness programs, those kinds of things.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Rebecca, looks like we have some questions.
We do. I'm going to start with a couple specific questions from Julia Gordon and then kind of a more general one from Eric Salk. But Julia was wondering, is FHA going to continue FHA HAMP?
So to my knowledge, FHA will continue FHA HAMP. It is part of their permanent loss mitigation waterfall, but that's, and we certainly would encourage them to do that. We also think that there's some tweaks that they could make there, and so any feedback that people have on the phone, we certainly are open to that and passing those suggestions along. And that's not fair that Julia gets to ask that.
And then to be evaluated for a HAMP Tier 1, do borrowers need to have a complete package in by December 30th, 2016, or just a partial package?
So to be evaluated for HAMP in general, you have to have an initial package submitted to the servicer on or before December 30th, 2016. And so initial package is your RMA form, which includes a hardship affidavit, the Dodd-Frank certification, some of your income documentation, preferably all of it, but at least some income documentation, as well as your 4506T or TEV. So those are the four components of your loss mitigation or your initial package that has to be submitted. The servicer, it does not necessarily have to be a complete loss mitigation application. It just has to be those components of the application. The servicer can work to complete the loss mitigation application in 2017 and then put the borrower in a trial.
That's helpful, thank you. And then another question from Eric around maybe working with states around hardest hit and to simplify the program. He raises a concern that many borrowers aren't able to access the program because of tight guidelines at the state level. If you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, so we've actually worked with all of the states over the years to continue to refine their programs and their eligibility criteria. So, you know, if there was a state in particular, we could talk to them more about that. But by and large, we've seen the states modify quite a bit of their requirements and expand their programs. So, like I said, if there's a state in particular that we should focus on, we're more than happy to do that. But we've also seen a lot of change over the years. And really the key piece with Hardest Hit Fund is getting the word out about what programs are available in each state to the homeowners.
Thank you. And then one, maybe not a last question, but another question. Will there be any kind of guidance or information forthcoming coordinating the principal reduction program at FHFA with HAMP, or how will that work?
So the recent announcement from FHFA about the GSE's principal reduction modification, we are supportive of that initiative, but it's not something that we don't issue the guidelines on that, and so I would have to direct you to FHFA or the GSEs for more information on that.
And then I think this will be our last question, but wondering if you could, well, questions just keep coming in, but we are going to have to wind this down.
Yep.
So if you could just speak briefly to a couple of states in hardest hit that have been particularly effective at using the resources and deploying them at the state level?
Yeah, so actually before we announced the additional funds being available in February, we actually had 7 states that had closed down their borrower portals and several others that were approaching closure as well and having exhausted all of their funds. So that's kind of an interesting question because a lot of the states, even if we have several, like I said, we had 7 that had closed, so Oregon, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and several others had closed down their borrower-facing portals, but we're still doing some other programmatic work as they work through the remainder of their funds. But it also is based on states who had utilized a lot of their funds. So while Michigan wasn't closed, they still had utilized a good portion of the funding that they have. So they fared well in Ohio as well, Illinois, North Carolina. A lot of those are states that are performing really well and have a lot that they're doing with HHS. And I've missed some as well, I'm sure.
Well, thank you for that, Danielle. And again, thank you for this presentation, and we will share it with the task force. I have notes about a couple of questions, and we'll try to connect you after this conversation to get the answers that you are looking for. But I want to make sure we have time for our other two presentations. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julia Gordon. And
hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
You sure can, Julia.
Okay, great. So I apologize for any technical issues here. I had promised I would show up at the NHC office and apparently forgot I was going to do that. So here I am at my office, and I can just, all I can say is senior moment. So what we're going to talk about two things today, and I know it's a long call, so we'll try to be relatively quick. And we've sent around a lot of written information that will expand upon what we're going to say today. But we wanted to briefly introduce the National Community Stabilization Trust to those of you who don't know us. And for those of you who do know us, and there may be folks on the phone who either are our sponsors or are among our community buyers, we want to talk a little bit about what we call NCST 2.0, which is kind of our recent reinvention as we've changed leadership and looked at a changing landscape to see in what new ways we can pursue our mission of strengthening neighborhoods, preventing neighborhood blight, and helping in revitalization efforts. So the trust was established in 2008 by several leading housing groups, LISC, Enterprise, HPN, NeighborWorks, later joined by NCLR and the Urban League. And the goal of creating the trust was to provide a way to move some of the vast amounts of REO that were created by the crisis into the hands of organizations who were engaged in neighborhood stabilization programs, particularly in conjunction with the HUD NSP program, to help those agencies acquire and rehab properties that had been lost to foreclosure during the crisis. And to do that job, NCST created a new technological tool that allowed this organization to receive REO properties from multiple sellers, aggregate them on one platform, and push out to potential buyers notices of the availability of REO in their particular footprint area before those REO hit the open market, so that they would have something of a first look at it. Using that system and the technology platform itself we call REO Match, and there's a bunch of processes around it, including a process for registering qualified buyers to participate. Through that system, since our founding, we've moved over 20,000 REO properties into the hands of neighborhood stabilization efforts, many of which have then been made available for owner-occupied homeownership in the neighborhoods, as opposed to just houses going into the hands of investors from outside the area who may or may not be doing rehab. So in NCST 2.0, we do continue everything that we have been doing in this REO Match system with a couple of changes. The first change is that we did not have a lot of success with significant numbers of donated properties. We found that often donations did not have good outcomes in the communities, and there is not as much donation work happening through us. As many of you know, there are still some financial institutions doing direct donations to neighborhood stabilization organizations. the other major thing that's changed in the last year is, for the first time, the platform is now hosting REO properties from Fannie and Freddie in 18 metropolitan statistical areas around the country. Those areas are, with the exception of St. Louis, all located east of the Mississippi, and there are heavy concentrations in Ohio, Florida, and the Northeast Corridor. Through this partnership with Fannie and Freddie has a name. It's called the Neighborhood Stabilization Initiative, and we began this work as a pilot in Detroit and Cook County, Illinois, where Fannie and Freddie offer their REO properties with what they call a cost avoidance discount. And again, this is offered to neighborhood stabilization buyers prior to these REO properties going on the open market. So this is before they go through what Fannie and Freddie call their first look, where owner-occupants also have the opportunity to see the homes. So that's the big news in terms of our REO work. Something else that has that's new at the trust in the past year or so is that, in partnership with the Housing Partnership Network, we are now managing a portfolio of highly distressed mortgages, of non-performing loans. We have received the bulk of these from Bank of America as donations, along with some financial assistance to enable the buyers to do what's necessary to either rehab or demolish these properties. Most of them are vacant. And we are beginning to add to this portfolio from some other financial institutions who have recognized that we're developing an expertise in managing highly distressed, largely vacant mortgages, which is a very different profile than properties where there is still a homeowner occupying the property who could potentially be assisted with a home retention option. With most of the notes in our portfolio, we will not have that opportunity. To the extent we do have that opportunity, HPN is our partner to help with the borrower contact, and then when it comes to the vacant properties, we manage these properties. A final change to our program in what we call NCST 2.0 is with my coming onto the team as Executive Vice President about 6 months ago, we've launched a fairly robust effort to get involved with policy issues and serve as an advocate to help communities address blight and the high rates of vacant and abandoned properties within their jurisdictions. We are endeavoring to pursue policy work at the federal, state, and local level. To the extent that we work at the state and local level, we work with local partners and try to support what's happening with municipalities, with local advocates, or with local legislators. So I think I'm going to stop there because we also want to talk about a specific policy area that we're beginning to delve into. But Rebecca and Ethan, I don't know if we want to take some questions on NCST's programs now and then move to the policy issue.
Julia, I would say, why don't you move through all the material, and then we'll give folks a crack at you at the end.
Okay, so just so folks know, I did what Rebecca sent around this morning included a basic fact sheet about NCST, as well as a more deep dive into how we manage these distressed mortgages through the Reclaim project, through our portfolio. I know many of you may be interested in that, so we tried to provide slightly wonkier detail on that. And what I'm going to do now is introduce Rob Sin. Rob is new to the policy community here in DC. He comes to us from Jersey City, New Jersey. He's an attorney who was working in the communities there on both rental and mortgage issues. And we're delighted to have him in the policy mix with us here, and I'm delighted to have him here at NCST helping me out. And so I'm going to turn the phone over to Rob now.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk about the fast-track foreclosure legislative initiatives that have come up since the crisis, and sort of in the last couple of months, we've seen a lot of activity as sort of a second wave. In the materials that were sent around in advance of this call, there's a Microsoft Word document that contains a whole bunch of links. One of them to get some deeper background into the fast-track foreclosure laws that have passed essentially since the crisis up until January of 2014. Jeff Walsh at NCLC did a really great comprehensive analysis of various different state laws already in play. What we're seeing now, at least since we've started delving into this in the last couple of months, is initiatives almost like a second wave now of fast-track foreclosure laws, some of which are entirely new to their states, like Pennsylvania and New York and Ohio. We recently were involved in Wisconsin, where they had passed a fast-track foreclosure law in 2011 that they just recently amended significantly. One of the other materials that was sent around was an op-ed from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel that we had submitted urging Governor Scott Walker to veto that amendment because there were problems that we have identified and that local advocates in Milwaukee had been fighting against changing that law. So to talk briefly about fast-track foreclosure laws in general, I think the concept behind them we agree with, which is solely in the context of vacant and abandoned properties. It's in the best interest of the community to have those properties moved through a faster foreclosure process so that empty homes don't sit there for months and months on end through various weather and various conditions that can create significant problems, not just to the property itself, but also to the community. They can become havens for crime, drug dealing, drug abuse. They are eyesores. They drag down property values, and they're also a black hole for tax revenue into those communities because you've got these properties sitting there with no tax payments being made. So, so the spirit behind Fast Track is something that, as an organization, we are on board with. However, there are some red flags that we have seen among some of these more recent initiatives. I'll talk about what we think a fast-track foreclosure law in general should look like, or what the good ones have been looking like, which is the process established for a determination of abandonment. These are typically limited, although there's been a few in non-judicial foreclosure states. Generally speaking, we're talking about judicial foreclosure states. What these laws do is either create a separate court or a separate track or a process by which a motion can be filed seeking for a court's determination that this property is vacant and abandoned. The laws usually contain a laundry list of criteria that, let's say 2 out of 10 or 3 out of 12 is sort of the average of what we're seeing. Broken windows, piled up circulars on front porches, no utility payments being made in X amount of months. The typical things that we see and associate with these vacant and abandoned properties. Once the criteria is established and a judge is convinced that the property is in fact vacant or abandoned, they can then proceed much more quickly. And the idea behind it being, if let's say a state had a 12-month redemption period for an occupied property, that can then get shortened to a much quicker window. For example, 5 weeks was what the original Wisconsin fast track law gave for a redemption period in a vacant or abandoned property. Thereafter, the bank would have to bring it to a sale, and hopefully that sale leads it to be put in the hands of someone who will put that to productive use. So those are typically what happens in a fast track foreclosure scenario. However, we've seen various different things in different states that we're not so fond of and that are being proposed largely by the lending community. For example, the bill that's currently on track to pass in Ohio sometime in the next 2 weeks doesn't just deal with vacant and abandoned properties. It makes significant changes to foreclosure law, which include the ability for, or actually the limitation on a borrower being able to use a lender's failure to produce a note as a defense to foreclosure. Essentially, this new law, if passed, will invite the process to go through without the bank having to produce a note. So that's just one of the things that we're not fond of, and that we have concerns about, and we're trying to keep our eyes on. There's legislation pending in Pennsylvania. There's a couple of different competing bills in New York. We've included links to materials about all of those, and if anyone has any input on activity going on in their states, we'd really love for you to reach out and see what we can do to try and be a part of the conversation. So with that, I'll turn it over to anyone who has questions.
Thank you so much, Julia and Rob. And we will take questions now from folks on the phone, but we're going to start with Ethan here in the room.
Yes, moderator's privilege. As you guys are working on state-level foreclosure issues, whether it's fast-track legislation or related stuff, we are happy to share with the task force. Over the past several years, we've had a few different presentations on it. I know it's of interest to a good chunk of the audience. So the best way to get stuff into our weekly email is send it to Rebecca. You can also send it to me, but all I'll do is forward it to Rebecca. So whatever works for you. But I would say I think it's helpful to get timely updates and also to draw connections between what's going on in different states so that we can share as much strength among the group as possible.
We do have a question about any work you've done specifically in New Jersey that you could elaborate on.
That's for you.
Oh, my work or NCST's work?
NCST's work, I believe, around the fast track issue.
New Jersey, I want to say it was either 2009 or 2010, I believe, had already passed a fast track law. We haven't been looking too much into that because it's already been in play. What we've been focusing on is states that are currently considering or have legislation pending. But I would point you, I know New Jersey is one of the 8 or so states that Jeff Walsh did some pretty great analysis about in his NCLC report, so I would recommend taking a look at that.
Great. I'm not seeing any other questions come in. Any comments from folks in the room?
I just want to say thank you to both Julia and Rob for sharing that info. We will make sure that, Julia, that all the documents you shared ahead of time go out with the notes so that people can see them and go directly to you with comments. Is your contact info in that set of stuff already, or should we include it if it's not?
You can include it if it's not. Feel free to include either of our direct contact information. Of course, the best way to reach us is always email. And I will note that if there's anybody on the phone who's been a buyer for us, you're probably already receiving our newsletter. But we have, in recent months, started to somewhat beef up our monthly newsletter. And so if there are folks who would like to receive that and want to contact me and get on the mailing list, we're trying to start reaching out to a broader community as we begin, as we start to work in the policy space. It's important for us to start developing the state and local relationships that will enable us to partner appropriately, and we've found a lot of really helpful and willing partners in the states we've begun to work in, and really look forward to working in other states. I should note that we have a whole team of folks that we call community development managers who focus on a subset of the 18 MSAs where we are doing the REO work with Fannie and Freddie, the Neighborhood Stabilization Initiative. And so we do also have folks on the ground. These managers are located, they live in the areas that they cover, and they do try to be pretty well acquainted with what's happening in neighborhood stabilization in those MSAs. And if you are in the neighborhood stabilization business and you don't know who our CDM is in your area, but you think there might be one, let us know and we'll hook you up.
Julia, can I ask you a quick question about New Jersey, or maybe Rob too? This is Brian, by the way, from NHC.
Hi.
I believe that there's an organization in New Jersey that's been around for a few years that was trying to do bulk purchase of REO properties, and the acronym escapes me right now, but I was wondering if either of you were familiar with that.
Sure. So New Jersey Community Capital, which is a very well-known CDFI in New Jersey, has been a leader in the NPL space. They have actually purchased several of the nonprofit pools that have been offered both through FHA and FHFA. They are working in New Jersey and in Florida, and I think in a couple of other places. They also have a large portfolio at this point of NPLs. The other nonprofit that's begun to get active in this NPL space is Hogar, affiliated with NCLR, and they also now have a fairly robust portfolio. The main difference between what NJCC and Hogar are doing and what we're doing is they are more focused on the homeowner retention side, whereas we're a little more focused on, well, we're kind of slightly further down the food chain, and a little more focused on highly distressed properties, many of which are vacant. But beyond that, we have been working, as have those nonprofits and many, many other partners, have been working with both FHA and FHFA to enable a much more robust role for the nonprofit and neighborhood stabilization community with respect to the non-performing loans that those agencies are disposing of. That doesn't necessarily mean we're advocating for all of them to be sold to nonprofits, because quite frankly, managing a portfolio of NPLs is extremely challenging, not something we would advocate for folks to do on kind of a retail basis. You need to work with the servicer. There's a lot that needs to be managed. But there are a lot of ways in which we believe the for-profit purchasers of these bulk notes must and should be working with nonprofits to ensure that neither Fannie, Freddie, nor FHA actually add to neighborhood blight through their decision to sell off these assets.
Oh, thank you.
Excellent. So I think we are on to our last speaker, right, Rebecca?
Yes, which is Brian Stromberg, who is a housing research specialist with NHC, and he's going to talk to us about his opportunity mapping work. So give me just 1 second to pull pull up his presentation.
And I know we've been on the phone for a while now, so I promise I'll be short and sweet. Short, at least, I guess. Okay. Well, thanks for having me on the call here. I'm going to talk really quickly about opportunity mapping. I don't know how many people are familiar with it on the task force, but it is becoming more of a popular topic in policy circles. So the way I would define opportunity mapping is as the use of geospatial data to define areas that have different degrees of opportunity. And how you define opportunity, usually it's defined through various socioeconomic indicators. The most common indicators for opportunity mapping are things like public safety, education quality, transportation access, public health, and other things that can improve or degrade the ability of households to have a higher quality of life. So that's opportunity, but what's the opportunity map? These are not actually opportunity maps, but I'll show you one in a second. The map itself is created by combining different indicators to create a composite index of opportunity, which is usually divided into very low, low, high, and very high, so you can categorize this any way that you want. The first, well, at least most well-known use of the opportunity map was by John Powell at the Kirwan Institute for Social, sorry, I got that wrong. At the Kirwan Institute, I'll just leave it at that. In his testimony for Thompson v. HUD, the idea is to use several different maps showing different indicators, which you can see on the screen here. These are three that were created by Powell, and you combine these to show a comprehensive opportunity index. And you can see in the legend at the bottom left, it shows the very low, low, moderate, high, and very high. So this is the earliest example, and this is the basic technique that's been refined over a few years, but this is essentially what it looks like. So why is opportunity mapping considered to be so important? Well, besides the fact that opportunity mapping can reveal pretty quickly and easily geographic disparities in terms of access to important resources or exposure to various negative environmental factors, spatial data has become really important in meeting the requirements of the new affirmatively furthering fair housing rule from HUD, which includes in itself a submission of assessments of fair housing. And while there is no explicit requirement by HUD in the rule to produce maps, the citing of affordable housing in areas of opportunity is an inherently spatial problem, and maps are essential to finding any type of solution, in particular to the spatial problem. HUD and other federal and local agencies have recently started making a point of making data more available to the public. They recently announced Opportunity Project. You can see the URL right there. Includes open data from different federal agencies and also from several different city jurisdictions too. It's actually a really interesting resource. If you have time and you're interested in data, it's definitely worth checking out. So the opportunity maps can be as complex as you want them to be. John Powell used 14 data sets that he put into 3 different categories. But you can see a more recent map, I'll show it to you, sorry. A more recent map made by the National Center for Smart Growth, which is housed at the University of Maryland, created a map for the Baltimore Opportunity Collaborative that used 92 data sets organized into 6 categories. And if anybody's interested in learning more about what they did a pretty good job, and it's definitely a good read. We can send it out if there's any interest in that. However, the more complex the map that you make, the more data that you use, the more difficult it can be to manage the variables responsibly. So while using a wide variety of variables can add nuance to a map, but does very little to add to the actual narrative. So you can see here some map samples that was made by the National Center for Smart Growth. You can see kind of the complexity, 92 variables, honestly is a little bit unwieldy, but you do get a lot of detail in the final product, which you can see here. What you can also probably notice is that there isn't much difference between this and John Powell's map. So while you might benefit from the nuance of detailed, complex data sets, the basic narrative is usually pretty clear using maybe 6 or 7. And the basic narrative is usually tied to concentrations of poverty and concentrations of race. So a couple things, and I told you this would be short and sweet, and I did not lie to you. A couple things to keep in mind about opportunity mapping. First, you want to make sure that you're using the right data with the right tools. And by the right data, I mean data that has a consistent level of detail or geographical scale. You don't want to mix in your counties with your MSAs, with your census tracts, with your block groups, or else you won't have an accurate product at the end. There's a lot of tools out there that you can use, a lot more than there used to be, even 5 years ago. They range from Esri's ArcGIS or the open source QGIS, which is really powerful desktop GIS software. QGIS is free, Esri is not. There's also a lot of options if you want to do online mapping, which might be familiar to some people. Mapbox, CartoDB, Social Explorer, Policy Map. A lot of these Policy Map and Social Explorer and ArcGIS Online are all subscription-based, but they also provide a ton of data, really easy to use and just readily available. Mapbox and CartoDB require that you bring your data to them, but they're also very powerful tools. The other thing to remember about doing opportunity maps is that they're a very powerful tool, but their creation has to be done very carefully, which means choosing the right data and then also choosing how the data is represented. Maps can be used to create much more inclusive policies, as in the case of opportunity mapping, but they can also create exclusive policies. Probably the best example of that is the practice of redlining, which we're probably all familiar with, I'm guessing. So the influence that representations of opportunity might have on the distribution of federal funding for local jurisdictions, state, county, city, makes this a very important issue and something to maybe keep in mind in the future. So,
and also making it worthy of a Spider-Man quote.
Worthy of a Spider-Man quote. I'm glad that someone picked that up. Yeah, I figured that someone would recognize that. I couldn't resist. We're also going to be publishing a more detailed, longer brief with some case studies at some point in the future. So if there's any interest in the task force in that longer brief, and also in the National Center for Smart Growth report that I mentioned earlier, just let, I guess, Rebecca know. She seems to be the one who's the contact point. So yeah, I welcome any questions.
So it looks like we have a question already. Rebecca.
So, good question. Why should organizations be investing in a more comprehensive opportunity index versus something simpler and already created, like perhaps persistent poverty via the CDFI fund?
That's a really good question. And I'm actually not familiar enough with the consistent poverty measure to talk about it. So I don't know, maybe someone else has some more insight.
So, I mean, I can offer a little bit of insight, and this came from a session we did with our Inclusive Communities Working Group for a group of state and local leaders in areas of high and rising housing costs that get together periodically. When Brian showed the 5 different maps that all then overlapped and combined into the more complex version, one of the things I took from seeing that and from other combinations of maps is, depending on how you define opportunity, you can actually get pretty different outcomes. When you layer 6 or 7 together versus layering 92 together, you start to see very strong patterns emerge. But in situations where you're going with a simpler mix and maybe only using 2 or 3 dimensions, it's possible to really overlook important dynamics, especially when you're using that information to cite housing, because housing is sticky, right? You build it and it's there for a long time, usually longer than anyone expected when they built it the first time. Go to New York City, you'll see that all over the place. If, for instance, you only looked at transportation accessibility, you would get one map that would suggest housing in particular places near transit lines. But if you start to overlay that with educational opportunities and school performance, you get a very different map. If you then overlay being close to employment, the map can look even more different. So I think the value of complexity and having multiple layers of information is getting you to a point where you feel like you've really captured the underlying dynamics of the community. And this is a challenge that often comes up in policy questions because for someone in the community, they know, oh, that's that side of the tracks, and this is this side of the tracks, and everyone knows who lives where and how things shake out. Sometimes those impressions are wrong, but often not. But from a little farther away, either from the state capitol or heaven forfend from Washington, D.C., it can be much harder to understand those distinctions. But from that greater distance, that's where the funding decisions are made. So creating maps with sufficient detail is a way to inform the policymakers to make the right choices. That's why we're urging folks to be careful, to use multiple data sources to really get as complete a picture as they can, recognizing that every data source and every layer you add adds complexity and challenge to the exercise. So it's a balancing act. We recognize that, but you do want to make sure you get a complete picture.
And there's, if I could just add a technical detail too, so the National Center for Smart Growth report actually used a really pretty sophisticated model of transportation access. So if you just map out something like which county has more bus stops, I mean, you're going to have larger counties are obviously going to have larger bus stops or larger tracks or whatever you want to use the measurement of. And so there's a lot of different ways of using the data that goes beyond even just choosing what aspects you want to look at. So there are a lot of kind of concerns with using more and more data, but if you want to get a really accurate picture, particularly because with things like transportation access, which is increasingly important in kind of fair housing questions and basic social equity questions, then you really need to think about how you're using the data, not just what data you're using.
And that's why I want to put another plug in for the brief that Brian has written up and that will be coming out probably in early June, maybe end of May, depending on our print development schedule. It's designed to be an easy way to step into these questions because a lot of folks are now having to work with opportunity maps in ways they haven't before. It's not a textbook. It's a short brief with some links and some ways to start learning. And it's deliberately so because we recognize there are a lot of folks who are getting into this for the first time. So I would say keep your eyes peeled for that. We will send it out to the task force, but it should be a great introduction to the subject.
Not seeing any other questions. I think we are going to wrap up today's task force meeting. Thanks to everyone for joining us and participating, and thanks to our speakers. And again, we will send out the notes and the recording to the task force within a few days.
Great. Thank you all for joining us.